Doing,
Hello,
Thomas?
sir.
Chetan? Y'all doing okay?
Yeah.
Oh, delightful.
Yep, no complaints.
Oh, good. Well, Thomas Jockin's working hard on his class, making it happen and asking really good questions on time preference. And then Chetan, I've been thinking about what's an operation between an executive. We were talking about like when Biden does an executive order to remove college debt and it's going to go to the Supreme Court. What exactly is an operation there? So I'm very curious to continue that discussion, Chetan, on power and law. And I've also been going down a really deep rabbit hole on the great Ivan Illich, on the difference between, because the class at Parallax is unplanned, we must unplan our lives, and the distinction between planning and being prepared, and how increasingly as the world becomes more and more unpredictable, that we have to be prepared more than plan. Brings in a little bit of the anti-fragility from Nassim Taleb. I can't know when a rock's going to hit the window, but I can check its structure so that I can tell if it can survive whenever the rock may hit its window, right? And how you have all of that. But those are some different thoughts. I'd be curious what you gentlemen have been thinking about. And Thomas Jockin, I really like the banner you sent was the graphic. I'm always impressed with like great graphic talent like that. So I salute you on that. That's really, really cool. But I'm down. I'm also be curious what you gentlemen have been thinking about lately. And I'm downstairs because it's gotten cold and the air conditioner is still in the window of the office, but now there's a crack in it. And I need to take it out entirely because now it's like 20 degrees up there, but I haven't taken the air conditioner out yet. So I'm downstairs today. But gentlemen, what have we been thinking about and working through, et cetera, so forth?
I mean, Chetan, I want to hear more about your this whole executive decision discussion and
Like
power part. I want to hear
law
more
and
about that. It's
power
really
and
interesting.
violence. Yeah, we had a lot of fun last week. Chetan, please.
Yeah. So just tell me where to start from, what where you were last time and what you were thinking in that sense. I remember I sort of sent it's interesting that last week I was struggling with putting a panel together for a conference basically. And the panel that I sort of sent was on this question of exception, informality, and law. And it sort of tried to argue that how the problem of the executive, if you look at the three arms, executive, judiciary, and the legislature, the executive is of course becoming stronger. That is one part of the symptom. The other is executive is also functioning through the judiciary and the legislature. The more and more laws that you are making and the more and more judgments that are coming from the court are actually not judgments of the court. They are actually executive functioning in the indirect manner. You can see that across the board. I'm sure it's happening in the first world. In the south here in India, this has become rampant. For example, if you have to remove a slum, so earlier judgments used to be very clear that you can't remove a slum unless you give other alternate housing to people living over there. Now, as judiciary is becoming more and more executized in that sense, now they're taking the more executive position where they're saying that the land is of the government and you're living there illegally and you can be removed and so on and so forth. So what you're getting is, in some senses, a form of executive which is functioning indirectly to all other branches of the state. The state itself is sort of mapping onto the executive much more strongly than ever did. And those idea of differentiation of power, all of those things are in many ways not things that we, at least our generation, would see in a way like the previous generation had. Those assumptions that we had that there is distribution of power, there is, different parts of government will function differently and so on and so forth. Those assumptions are fast shifting in today's world, in late capitalism. Even in US, for example, the Supreme Court, the whole battle of Supreme Court that Trump was trying to sort of fight, and judges that have, you'll see the abortion, you'll see that many new forms of lawmaking itself would be conducted from the perspective of how those laws have to be, how order has to be maintained within the state. I don't know how you look at it, but I think maybe that's maybe the starting.
What's interesting, the first thing that just comes up for me with that is it's kind of interesting, like what exactly is the power? So, our president is President Joe Biden. So when Joe Biden does an executive order, is that power of law? It seems like it's not. It seems like it's the power of the executive. But it's kind of interesting because we you almost kind of just feel like it's law because he writes something, but it doesn't seem to be the same kind of power as, say, the judiciary, right? So it's kind of interesting because once you like point it out, isn't it funny how we basically treat all power of the state, maybe subconsciously when we don't think about it, as legal power? But it almost does seem like it's a different kind of power, isn't it? Like it's an executive power that's simply the power of thus spoke Biden, thus spoke Trump, thus spoke the White House. And actually the law exists as a kind of corrective of that or to stand against it. That's very interesting that you point. Like, what is the character of that power that is coming out, especially when it's outside the law or it's opposed by the law or challenged by the law? That's very interesting. Mr. Jockin, please.
Well, yeah, to build on that, I mean, on two parts. Part one is I think it's very true. It's funny because for democracies generally, they're supposed to be structured that the legislative body is supposed to be the originator of the laws. Remember, the Supreme, I can only speak in the United States context, right? Our Supreme Court, it was a power that they claimed for themselves that they had the right to review the laws and make calls about it constitutional, not the Madison case. That was the original intention was always legislative was the kind of seed and origin point, kind of the soul of the political body, and the law was supposed to be legislative. Let alone the fact that we were supposed to be basically effectively kind of a United Nations of states originally, right? Each state was supposed to be their own sovereign technically. So even then our relationships were very different, supposed to be very different. It's still true today because technically almost all the federal laws that affect us is under commerce clauses or some basically argument of you took basically federal money, either Title IX, for example, civil rights stuff, or et cetera, or Medicaid support. Thus, we still have a relationship of the federal to the state relationship, which is supposed to be independent. It's just that through these kind of New Deal era bondage, basically, or associations, it's definitely been transformed. There's one thing I want to add, just I can contribute to this, is within design. So, for example, like we have laws since, I think ADA was 1970s, 1980s. It deals with disability access. So the idea is that any building infrastructure built that is meant to be on public accommodation, which is basically anything public facing, has to be designed for accessibility for people who have disabilities. So wheelchairs, ramps, which is actually really interesting. So that law was made in the legislative body, but there's basically a executive appointed body that sets the actual mandates of ADA. It's not the legislature who set the laws of how the sidewalks have to be a certain degree, a certain angle, for example, or you have to have these many parking spaces that are handicapped relative to the whole ratio. That's not decided by the legislators. That was delegated out to a basically non-voted executive appointed body that meets in them. It's public record. You can go find it. Like they have meetings at the ADA. These are basically architects and other bureaucrats who are been appointed that decide all those protocols, which are then mandated as law to then be applied to every building, architecture, structure in the United States. And if they violate those mandates of those these executive appointed bureaucrats, they're in violation of the ADA laws. So I'm pointing out this picture that we've had this kind of transformation that generally the old traditional mode is that, well, the legislature would actually declare what is the legal mandates of this statute, right? That's been abstracted away to now this basically technocratic infrastructure that is basically kind of similar to our federal banking system, executively appointed and managed. So now the executive is basically superseding or actually adding the final garnishing note to the executive branch's thrust or idea that actually make all the difference, because it actually defines explicitly what is the violation or not. Do you have enough parking spots for handicapped people? Is your stairs the right slope, etc.? That's not answered by that gets moved away from a deliberation within the public body. It's moved to a separate independent entity that's executively focused, just like especially Federal Reserve policies are similar in the same way. It's not like we're speaking publicly about what should be the Federal Reserve rate for our loans, for example. That's been abstracted away from any kind of public discussion. That's all I got.
No, that's very interesting. I'll give it to Chetan. Andrew Luber, good to see you, sir. Because I like that you brought up the delegation, because it's almost on that part people are acting on behalf of the law, but it's not even clear yet how the law is going to manifest, and it starts taking on a bit of that Joseph K. character of Before the Law, when he's like, I want to go read the law, and he's like, well, wait here, we'll get it for you, and he waits there his entire life, and they're like, sorry, we didn't get around to it, we couldn't find it. And that's interesting because that makes me think of law as rumor, just like we were talking before, where demand has this rumor structure, and like law then has this kind of rumor structure where it's there and it pops up this way and it goes away. That's very interesting. Let me give it to Chetan.
Yeah, maybe I was thinking it may be helpful to maybe draw the contours for this kind of a problem in some sense via some question. So when you look at the problem that you say, talking about the executive order in that sense, see, executive, why is there a provision for executive order being there in the first place? That's the question we should ask. If we have to honestly see that, and we have to ask, and the problem emerges that law and its application is never a fully consistent affair. We have always talked about this question of incompleteness. That we know that there is some form of agency, that human agency, decision making always comes in, no matter how consistent your legal system is. That is something we recognize. Even this imagination that our country is run by law always had this gap within it of human decision agency, because law itself never fully translates into its own application. There's always a gap between this affair. And we give executive these powers because executive then act in a manner that it can get legitimacy retroactively later on once the law is passed, because those kind of moments can arise where the execution happens first and the law retroactively gets made later on. That's always a possibility within any application of law. That is there for those things that this kind of pacing is. The problem that we are starting to see emerge one is a more theoretical issue and one is a more practical issue. One, as we discussed, that law is not simply its content. It's something which I think Agamben sort of gets it right in his book, State of Exception. I think this was started by Benjamin, if I'm not wrong. Agamben sort of goes back to Walter Benjamin, if my memory serves right. I haven't researched upon this question in a long time, but that these two are never consistent things. For example, if a policeman on the street tells you something, it may be the most arbitrary thing. He stops you, for instance, in US. You're driving on the lane, he stops you, you were driving in the right speed, everything. You know what he's done is illegal. Yet what he says to you gets a force of law. His word becomes the law at that moment. So the content of law always is, in some senses, in friction with its own force. The force can be broken from the content applied elsewhere. So any arbitrary decree can become the law even when it has no legal basis. Because of this incompleteness question that is, law doesn't sort of translate itself in its application. Given this fact, the practical problem that arises is that law has becoming more and more vacuumed out from within. Now people realize that you don't need the content of law at all, when you can only function with the force of law. That is where we are heading towards. That today we are realizing that we just need the notion of the law in the background. We don't need its content explicitly marked out, because that makes governance more difficult. Governance is much more easier when law is functioning retroactively always, where the content is fuzzy enough that we can apply the force of law wherever the need arises and get the law retroactively back again. And that's giving us all kinds of results. And that is where the right-wing movement is sort of becoming stronger, because the right wing can do this job much more effectively than Democrats can across the world. The right government is much more capable of doing this flip than the Democratic Party can. And that is where they have much more legitimacy on the basis of order and governance. They say we can handle terrorism better. They say we can handle, ordering better. We can get people out, because they don't worry about the content of law. They are only using the force of law in that sense. So the question becomes, then how do we understand the switch taking place, where the content itself starts sort of getting vacuumed out from, and to what degree you can use the force of law without it having any content? What is the breaking point of that game that you are playing in some senses?
No, that's very interesting. I think that's a very interesting question. And I think it's That was marvelous. I'm going to give it to Thomas Jock and Andrew Luber. So now I have this distinction in my head between like notion law and content law. And increasingly, law with content is becoming just notion, just kind of notion. And it's interesting, too, because as you were speaking, I almost have this image of like, you know, the observer said the quantum, it's there and it's not there at the same time until you observe it. And then it's there as if it was always there. And like the police officer can retrospectively say, well, that was the force of law. And then it's a flip moment, as I'll call it in the conflict of mind, where it was always the force of law. And yet it wasn't in that between space. And what do we do where law increasingly, I like what you said, it's becoming like vacuum from the inside out, where it's almost like law as might. Like law as might be. Like I like might because it's like power, like law as might. Like might is right, but then might in the maybe. Like it's like law is increasingly getting this kind of might character to it. And what does that mean? What does that do to us? What's the nature of the state and so on? But let me give it to Mr. Jockin and then Mr. Luber. I appreciated what you said, Mr. Chetan. Thomas, please.
Yeah, these are great points. I mean, obviously, the line that kept echoing in my mind is the sovereign is the one who declares the exception. Right, that keeps echoing in my mind, and that sovereign can be any entity that quite. I mean, I've had conversations with Daniel about this separately, related to belonging again. That a lot of times with power, it's acts as a given. It's when it's not stated. Power only works really a lot of times when it's implicit and it's taken as a given. When you actually have to make the power explicit, it's when it loses all its capacity to actually exist as a power. Also, and I don't mean that necessarily. We were talking about this kind of dangerous, like kind of the arbitrary danger aspect of it, because it can just rupture an exception at any time it desires. But it's not necessarily always a bad thing, because proper leadership, you do have, when this is done ordered the right way, there is a kind of self-trust of the leadership of organization, for example, that you're not going to interrogate a person in every single moment about their decision's validity and solidness. You say, I trust this person. I may not understand what's going on, but I trust this person to guide us the right way, which kind of puts a very interesting spin on that. But we usually talk about this in antagonistic modes, but I want to be fair and say, I think a lot of times proper leadership in organizations and in relationships does have a sense of givenness that it's in play here, that I wanted to reflect on a little bit. But the other part is, a lot of this is also predicated on precedence, which is not it's like, for example, like the idea of impeaching presidents, like the United States. That's when we had the Andrew Johnson impeachment. That was a huge deal. Like in the study of American history, it looked like it was so obvious he was going to get impeached because the North was dominant. They wanted their blood. They wanted their flesh on the South, and they were going to get it. And Johnson was not going to do it. So they were charged for impeachment, and it looked like it was very clear he was going to lose. He was going to get the impeachment, and it showed very clearly the nature of dynamics of how the impeachment process was going to be used. But because that's the narrative of certain senators opted not to do it, and they paid the price massively. They basically lost all their positions when they did that. That set a precedence to say, we do not use impeachment this way. That's not the force of law. That's an impeachment that can easily be always dismissed. But a lot of, as I'm also pointing out again, that's like I don't know where to put in precedence in that, but it's definitely a nature of a given. But it's a weird kind of given, because when people point to and act as if like it's a power of a law, but it's not. It could be broken. But we feel like if that gets broken, these precedents of certain expectations, something very delicate in the dynamics of the law is getting violated. That's kind of a weird, maybe the mythos of democracy. I'll be first to grant that point, but I'm pointing out that, like, I'll be honest here. Maybe mythos is required for any social organization to occur. But I'm just kind of throwing this out there just as a point. I don't have any strong opinions on that. I could be challenged on any of this, but those are just my reflections.
Chetan, please.
One thing, yeah. I just remembered, I said something wrong. It was not Walter Benjamin. Walter Benjamin has written about it, but Derrida's paper called Force of Law. Somewhere a government develops it. I'm just putting in. I'm sorry, I just forgot, so I just want to correct myself. Yeah.
Oh no, don't be sorry. I've misattributed things to different thinkers all the time, and then wake up in a cold sweat 3 weeks later. I'm like, oh my god. So no worry. I'm very so there's a few things, like I think that's exactly right, and then I'll give it to Mr. Luber, that where givens go away, then because to me, when law doesn't have the givenness, it almost has to move to the mightness, because it might be there, but it's not there solid enough to examine, because if it was, it would be deconstructed and losing that givenness. So it moves to this kind of might character, but then this has that kind of evanescent feel to it that seems like it's very problematic. But then at the same time, it could be good if you have like a benevolent dictator or something, right? Like if you have leaders that are able to like use it benevolently, it could be good. The problem is, like, obviously, when we look through the Federalist Papers or whatever, they're like, we're not going to take that bet. The likelihood that you'll have corruption is too high, so you make checks and balances. Well, what do you do when that doesn't work or something? Now that would get us, and I think there's probably a lot of that has occurred because the Supreme Court has power over the interpretation, and if the interpretation becomes unbound to the law, arguably, now we'd have to get into the great debate between Ginsburg and Scalia on that, living constitution, originalist, and all that. But that's where, but what's interesting is that starts to right there point to how there's some additional layer to law that is not included in law, right? Like you're saying the precedents, it's kind of like culture. It's like a culture. It's like, well, we just don't use impeachment that way. But right there, the reason why this is so fascinating to me, because for the last few weeks, we've noted how economics is determined on a non-economic space to be possible. What we see here is that law is no different. Law requires something outside the law to be possible. And, you know, the way that Hayek makes a distinction is he says the majority of society are not laws. It's like, something like social habits. Like there's no law that says you can't sit where somebody puts a coat over the chair, right? Like you're not going to go to jail if you sit where someone drapes a coat over the chair. And yet the society functions because people don't break in lines. People don't, do things like there's all of these organic organizing principles that are not legal and yet necessary. And what's curious is it's almost like you got two things going on. You have law because it's lost its givenness, is trying to have the same formal structure as culture, and that makes it in this weird might space. But then culture, nobody agrees on because everyone has different principles about how you should be organized. So you have this kind of like both are trying to be the other, and that ends up not really working so well, or it becomes very difficult to kind of place things. Now, I'd have to expand on that, but I think it does. I'll give it to Mr. Luber, but I think it does point to how law seems to be dependent on something outside of law. Because here's the thing, if law literally tried to have the function of culture, it would be totalitarianism, right? It wouldn't feel like law at all. It would feel like force. Like if literally every organizing principle, including coats over chairs, was legally enforced, funny enough, the law would almost not feel like law anymore because it wouldn't feel like it has any just basis. It wouldn't feel like it's there for the society. It would feel like it's replacing the society. And so that's what's so weird. Like once law kind of overreaches this unspoken invisible bound, it feels like something else. Now it just feels like power or something. That'd have to be expanded on, but those are thoughts that are coming to mind. But let me give it to Mr. Andrew Luber. Mr. Luber, it is good to see you, sir. I hope you are doing well.
Thanks for having me, Daniel. I'm doing pretty good. This is, as usual, a very interesting conversation. I just wanted to say, so whenever you look at content close enough, no matter what the context is, you realize that the content isn't what makes the content. The content arrives from something other than the content itself, no matter what the context is. So I'm not surprised that we're finding, economics, the motivation of economics isn't something economical. And same thing with like the law. And I think, as we talk about different topics, which I'm sure we will as time goes on, we'll realize that for each topic. I think with law, I think law should be treated as a space that allows for behaviors to occur. So in that sense, with like your culture comment, law should afford the possibility of culture and not be culture itself. So what that means to me is law needs to be structured and not in like an abstract way, but like in a way where it is a notion. It is like I don't want to say like an oblique notion, but it's something that's not specific. Like you can't cut in line, you can't do this. And but if law ever does become very particular in its form, then we're entering a very scary state where culture is merging with law. So law needs to be inherently, I want to use the word thematic, but like abstract. Like there's a certain abstraction with law where you can come up with, like, the ability to come up with loopholes around laws should always be a possibility. Essentially because the law should always just take into account what could be and not what is, in a certain sense. So because law's kind of dealing with like the possibility state and not the is state, the is state is for the culture. The is state is for the culture. The possibility state is for the law, for the is state to emerge out of that possibility state, if you will. And then one more thing, I think givens allow people to get comfortable, you know, when and allow people to not think. And I know we've talked about how people are scared to actually think and how, you know, arduous it is to actually think, but the mightness state, so to speak, that you were saying, that's a dimension where thinking occurs in. And if you live in a society that's scared to think, not willing to think, then they're going to continually double down in a given state. And if you continually double down in a given state, what will happen is law merges into culture, because there has to be this oscillating back and forth between whatever is and what possible and the possibilities in which that is arrived out of. So if you don't oscillate back and forth and you're just one-sided and you're just on what is all the time, then you're never going to be able to think, and you'll find yourself losing your, in my opinion, your identity. Like I should be able, like I saw on Instagram the other day that Skittles are going to be banned in California in 2027. I was like, what? Banned? And it's like, the reasoning is it causes cancer. And I'm like, okay, I get that. I get, like, Skittles aren't healthy. We've always known that, though. Like, no one has ever said, eat Skittles to make yourself feel better. Like, it's a delight. It's a treat. Like, we shouldn't have to, like, banning. I'm not a cigarette smoker. I think they're gross and disgusting, but I don't think we should, like, ban the bad things that we find pleasure or rather enjoyment. I just think at that point, when you are banning specific things, or you are making it harder to do specific behaviors that are, in this case, only bad for the individual who are doing these specific behaviors, that is a clear sign of law becoming culture. Like, the law should allow me to do specific behaviors that may be possibly bad for me. The point of the law is for the state to just run well. If I have, you know, if I give myself cancer, that's on me. I feel like that's not necessarily related to the state. I get the, like, an extreme point of view where it's like, well, if everybody is giving themselves cancer, then there won't be a state. But that's not realistic. Like, not everyone is eating so many Skittles to the point where it's like a crisis for the state to even run well. Like I would love to hear the argument for banning Skittles equates to the state running well. Like, and obviously there's a whole discussion on what does it mean for a state to run well. I mean, I would leave it up to you guys to say that way more than me, but I just don't find a plausible argument for Skittles and California as a state running efficiently, or efficiently is not even the best word, but running well. Yeah.
So Breaking Bad season 3 is going to be the Skittles edition. I just have this of Walter at the border of freaking California getting his Skittles. There's going to be a Skittles black market in California. Okay. Well, that's where all the money's going. I also have this image of this government laboratory getting millions of dollars over the years, just millions and millions, and someone kicking open the door, running down the hall with the paper. It's like, John, we figured it out. It's Skittles. Skittles is causing it. Yes, I have this image of the government employee running down, ban them all. Like this is a gift. This was a gift for me. Thank you, Andrew. I'm so glad to know that the United States of America is a place where Skittles are being banned. Thank you. 2 comments, and I'll pass it to Chetan. It's almost like if you don't think the might, then there's a void that law as might rushes in to fill. And so if thinking isn't doing its job, then law tries to run in. And that makes sense because law is like, you don't have to think. You just follow the law. It gives you this direction. So there might be something where if we don't do the thinking and the might, thinking the might, then what we're going to do is have law as might to fill that void. And that has a bunch of unintentional consequences. And the last thing I'll say is there's an interesting kind of structure for me that kind of emerges. Like this idea where you said law affords culture, but, law can't equal culture. It's very interesting because it's like X to Y, but you could also argue that culture affords law, right? You need a culture for law. So it's almost like you got like X arrow Y, and that's how it needs to be. But if it's ever X equals Y, you're screwed. And that seems to apply for economics, law, story, all of these different things, right? Like, if the story equals the thematic statement, like it's literally just the statement of the theme, there is no story, right? It has to afford it. It goes back and forth, but it can't equal it. And it's very interesting that this structure that you kind of see here is this X arrow back and forth between X and Y, and we have to somehow, well, this would be active thinking, right? There's something that tends to move to an equal sign. And once you get the equal sign, you get a lot of trouble. But let me pass it on. Did you want to say, Mr. Luber? Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question for you guys, and also I just wanted to say that. So, real quick, they think they're thinking by making Skittles not legal in 2027. So my first question is, how do you show that they're not actually thinking in the genuine sense of thinking? And then the second question is, just like with story, how story, comes from theme, but like when you're creating the story, you're oscillating between the story and theme. You're going back to the theme. You're always revisiting it while the story is unfolding. It's like you're saying, it's the same thing here with culture and law. There should be this oscillation. I mean, I posit that law is like culture comes from the law. Maybe I'm wrong for that, but I'm definitely confident in what you're saying, which is there is this oscillation and shouldn't be this equal sign. So then my next question is, how do you hold law in a way and culture in a way that affords the oscillation to occur? Not like for smart people that are thinking about what is like the motivation or the cause of things, but the everyday person that wants to figure out, how to vote or how to be the right citizen to put themselves and other citizens in a position to be able to oscillate in their own way between law and the culture that they're in. So those 2 questions, and I can repeat the second question because I know I kind of at the end there, but yeah.
No, it's excellent. I'll pass it to Chetan and then Tom. For me, what you are asking on how do you keep that, you have to be able to tell the difference between wisdom and fear, which our Parallax 2023 November course is all about with Ivan Illich. The difference between, once people can't tell the difference between wisdom and fear, you're screwed. Because like you have to be able to wisely now, because I think the difference between when is it wise to ban Skittles and when is it not? When are you acting out of wisdom or are you acting out of fear? Because if you're acting out of fear, then law is going to equal culture. That's the only way to make sure bad things don't happen. But then you have to have the wisdom to discern what level of risk is necessary to keep law from equaling culture. And you also have the wisdom to know that if they equal one another, you're in a Kafka story called The Trial of Joseph K. Because I actually think that whole book, I think the crime that Joseph K. broke without knowing it was social norms. I think that's what it's actually about. The whole Kafka story is about a world where law equals social norm. I have to defend that on a reading of the Joseph K. trial. I might succeed. Who knows? I just, I tell myself I did because I can sleep at night. But basically, it all hinges upon a culture being able to tell the difference between wisdom and fear. All hinges might be a little much because there's a lot loaded in that, but that is a central tenet of this problem, in my opinion. But let me pass it on to Chetan and then Mr. Jockin. Chetan, please.
Yeah, thank you. So many interesting points. I don't know where to sort of put my head on it, but I try to write things down for that reason.
Skittles. Just start with the Skittles. That's all. Just they're banning Skittles. That's all.
No, I go back to, I think, Dawkins' point about there being something outside the law. I think that's the important, very important theoretical problem in that sense, that law always demands somebody to act on its own exception. Law cannot function without exception in that sense. If you look at early Foucauldian sort of thinking around this problem, he said there's something like sovereign power, then you move into disciplinary power, biopolitical power, and immediately, and even Foucault realized it, that no matter how much we sort of moved away from the sovereign, a sovereign always re-emerged as a problem within the law itself, because law always demanded that somebody had to act where the exception arises. That is why you have the executive also. You know, that law is never consistent, complete, whole in that sense. There's always a point when you make a decision on the exception. And what do you do at that point? And I think that's what Thomas was sort of telling us there, and that is where the problem of planning and all of these things sort of gets bundled together. And once you have this problem, exception constitutively as a part of the law, not as something other to the law. It's not something like which happens once in a while in the legal framework. It's something which is a constitutive part of the functioning of law itself. Automatically, you don't get away from the sovereign, you get re-emergent sovereign in different forms. Judith Butler famously called these petty sovereigns. That's a word she gave. Agamben sort of had this theory of sovereignty emerging from here, that what you get is a certain forms of sovereign which decide on the exception. So each situation demands its own sovereign to emerge. So immediately you make an exception in a situation and you realize who's the sovereign over there. You know, like we are talking, we are all hunky-dory. Suddenly I start shouting and doing something weird. And Daniel will sort of, tell me, what are you doing? So you will know who the sovereign is. It's the person who has to make that decision. You may not know it when things are working normally, but the minute you make something, an exceptional situation arise, you realize somebody will emerge as a sovereign from the other side. And that's the underlying matrix in which this functions. The problem of power is a very interesting one within this. And I'll not sort of go along. I would want to say something on the Skittles question also, but the culture problem basically. But the problem of power was always very interesting because people thought that law, as far as it is functioning, can be a check to power, which sort of emerged more from a more earlier thinking that truth in some senses is the right check to power. The truth in some senses checks the sort of misuse of power, question of justice, and so on and so forth. And I think Nietzsche first and Foucault subsequently showed very interestingly that truth is not an adequate tool to do that. In that sense, that truth can become a part of the way the power functions at all points of time. And we can see it many places, this kind of phenomenon happening, which I don't think Zizek sort of in his philosophical thinking takes it very seriously. But that question has to be given its right importance, that truth in itself is not a check to power at all points of time. What do we do about it? How do we think through it? And in that same line, you can immediately see that law itself is not a check to power. Because law always demands, you can have certain modes of power where law functions well. That is possible. But if you have a certain point where power has taken certain kinds of modes of functioning, you cannot stop that functioning only through law. There is something about that problem. And that is where I think you can get back to the question of culture also. That law itself can't dictate cultural attitudes or cultural modes of production. If it starts doing that, you've already lost the cultural battle. You've already gone at some point from which there is no regaining. Law can't do that. We want law to be a given in that sense, law to function like culture. There is that fantasy, but law itself can't do it. There's something, because law always presupposes certain violence for it to function. Law cannot function without its necessary violence. how do we, that's what the whole problem is, that there's some force that is required for law to be held in place. If you do something illegal, I have to apply some force to you. And that is where law gains legitimacy, if there is something backing it up in that manner. So if culture has to be held together through law, you already enter into what you call mass culture in Hannah Arendt's terms. How do we understand that movement then?
You said a lot of really good stuff. I'm going to give it to Thomas Jock. And now I've got in my head, like, what are the difference between law and leadership, law and order? Like, is order just law? Like, law that creates a framework versus law that intervenes. So, like, law and order, like, are they the same things? There's also something about, like, law exists, so I have a sense of what the other is going to do. Like, before law, and you're in these endless, like, revenge wars, you could, I guess, talk about Hobbes, the Icelandic. Like, if I know murder is illegal, then I know there's a chance if I walk down the street, the guy I don't know won't murder me, right? So it makes the other more intelligible in a way, or more predictable, maybe not intelligible. And so there's that kind of way about it. But then that works because of a violence. There's a lot there. I'm now thinking about also the difference between ethics and law. Like, ethics is an organizing principle. I guess you could say what ethics is to social organization, violence is to legal organization, maybe. Like, ethics is like, it's just wrong to break in line, right? There's no force of law, but it's wrong. So it's interesting because maybe what ends up happening is, as a society not necessarily becomes less ethical, but has more ethical opinions, right? Like, different people, like, so then the ethics is like more not given. If I use that language, then it's like, well, law will rush in to fill that. But the problem is law can't rush in to fill that without replacing culture. Then law equals culture, and now you have all of these problems we're getting at. I'll have to think more, but let me pass it to Mr. Thomas Jockin. Mr. Jockin, please.
I mean, to build what you're saying, Daniel, I mean, there's two parts. Part one is Aristotle has two ethics books, Nicomachean and Eudaimonia. And it's so interesting how he concludes it. Nicomachean is for the basic plebs, where they cannot self-regulate. And the law is designed to structure their souls to be virtuous, to love the noble and to hate the viceful. So this question, first of all, on this question of law and culture, which one sits next to where, we have to be honest. Like, the ancients have a very different opinion. They're very clear. The law is meant to shape people because they can't do them themselves, with the exception of the noble. The noble basically self-regulate because they already love God. And then everything they're doing is in relationship to God, which is the highest standard. So they don't need the law because they are the law, effectively. Because, and he says a very interesting line in Eudaimonia Ethics at the end about this, where wisdom gives command, but not in the sense of an imposing, but by a kind of beloved love. So it's kind of a filial fear of the Lord kind of energy. You're going to kind of pull some Aquinas in there. Basically, if everyone was perfectly virtuous and perfectly noble, there would be no need for law because we're all self-regulated by the common good. That's not the case. Thus, we get two ethics. And by the way, Plato did exactly the same move too. That's why his Republic versus the Laws, very different game of how it's getting played. By the way, another note is on this aspect too, on this oscillation between the culture and the law. Aristotle has a big comment about this, where laws are meant to be universal. Like, laws by definition are such blunt instruments of universality, they cannot address the particulars. So there's a virtue called it's funny, this term's like wildly reused or just transformed over time, but the equitable. So the equitable is the man who applies the law to the particular circumstances where it's not fitting. So they fit the law to the particular circumstance to render justice. So this is that's where it's a very interesting mode here about this kind of sovereign who is the exception or applies the exception. Because in Aristotle's accounting, well, he's applying the exception because the universal law doesn't fit. It's not fitting to the universal standard of justice. So they need to comport the law to fit this particular circumstance, judged by the equitable one. The man is the judger of that. So that's a really fascinating interpretation of that. The one last note, to kind of bring this from abstractions to a little more concreteness, I teach. So here, I'll tell you point blank, I am that sovereign. You know why? Because I make a syllabus every semester for my classes. And I have rubrics for all my assignments. I work in the arts. So Actually, by the way, Chetan, your comment about the truth being the Nietzschean kind of energy about it, when the truth is a question of correctness, that is absolutely true. Because you know why? I'll give you a point. In my discipline, so in graphic design, we have certain terms we use that are sense-based. So the meaning like they're when I say like trying to think of a good word, legible. That's a common term in our field. That term legible has very particular senses and applications and consequences that if you are not in graphic design, you do not know what that means. And if you just use a general definition of, you just a nomenclature point of view of legible, that is not valid. In fact, I have the power and the authority to, in my rubrics to say, no, your use of that concept is not correct. I am the sovereign. I am the determiner of the application of that term in its sense. Now you have the right to interrogate with me to come to understand my sense of that term, but nevertheless, it's still my sense because this is my classroom. I am the sovereign to determine what terms are used in what concepts in what way. Now, I also will comment that power only goes so far because there is absolutely, I would say norms or mythos or culture absolutely involved. I say this because I have students who come in who do not have, I shall say, a graphic design cultured background. This is very hard to pin down, but I know when I have students who are not graphic design students, they're some other major. They don't get it. It's literally like, it's almost like that, literally like you're not a cool kid. Cool kids get it. They get all this implicit vibes. Like when you hear terms of like the vibe, and then the vibe's not hitting. These are all the norms and nonverbal, like to sit there and have to explain the vibes or the norms when people don't get it. It's actually really taxing and you're super not cool. Like you're super ostracized from the group because you're not getting it. And in fact, that's a marker of your not being cool and lower social status because we have to sit here and explain what legibility is, what is asymmetrical composition, what's hierarchy, for example. Again, I'm using technical terms. And then go even more particular, we say like you're to use a Clarendon serif design typeface for this project. Again, super technical particulars that have a particular sense that if you just rip out the dictionary and said, oh, there's an analogous term similar to Clarendon, I go, that's cute. That's not the sense I meant. Go back and fix the project. So again, you notice that's where power gets applied. And yeah, let's be honest here. There is the mechanism of the grade, the GPA, blah, blah, blah. So there is absolutely this kind of mechanism of play of power because there's a resource of reward and punishment that can be mechanized explicitly. So I'm just meditating on this point to point out that in the classroom, this plays out precisely as we're talking about. I just want to paint that picture. Now, I'll be honest here, the best classroom experiences is when the law is never applied. Like when the best classes I've ever had was when the law was never necessary because guess what? They were the noble students. They used the Aristotelian model. They got it. They already had the internal law inside them within this discipline. So we got to go to pure culture, norm, ethos, and questions of, is this the best? Is this the excellence we could achieve for this within our domain? And then I can move them by motivation, enthusiasm, all that towards there. When you're stuck just using the law to keep slamming them where, nope, your sense is wrong. Nope, your sense is not the sense. This is the sense. Trust me, that's no good. That is a very, shall we say, not thriving culture, not thriving dynamic. So I know this is a very interesting question for Daniel of creativity. Trust me, you're not getting anything creative out of students or dynamics when the law is being applied that bluntly. And I think generally everyone would agree when the law is being forced to be used excessively, you can get best compliance. You can at best get compliance and repetition, never creativity, and certainly never love, or the kind of the higher virtues of generation that can come out of that, which is interesting, right? Because there's a lot of talk in Plato, especially on the question of the law being beautiful, which is again, we're at the point where this is basically now become a political position where is the United States an actually good, virtuous entity where supposedly the mythos of the Constitution being this beautiful architect, this beautiful entity of creation of law and freedom, or the generation of freedom. But it's meditating on that. It's very different from this kind of coercive, bureaucratic, technocratic kind of attitude about it. So even notice that discussion about the law is very different play. I said a lot of things. I threw a lot of ideas. I'm going to call it a day. That's it for me.
That was beautiful. It maybe there's a bunch of things. So it makes me think of like the beautiful law is almost like a good dance partner. It knows when to lead, when to back up, when to make space for freedom, when to step in. It has this kind of flow to it. I also really like this idea of coolness, kind of like what is coolness as this kind of getting it-ness, like you get the culture, because that does seem to be what coolness is, like where what a people or a group or a clique or whatever define as cool is the people who do not have to be explained, who just get it, who don't kill the flow, who don't kill the vibe. I mean, we see this play here in the net, right? Like if I right now say, go, what do you mean, Jockin? Like I'd kill it. Like the flow would die. It's like, what does that mean? Or if I were to go, I don't understand, and just stare at you, right? Like it kills everything. Like every conversation can like put these dynamics at play if someone just doesn't get how you do a conversation. Like when you hear like you can never make it too explicit one way or the other. You have to know the vibe. And if you let that occur, then stuff starts working and coming together and you can get something moving. And it's interesting because then like, if you have to, like, obviously, like you say, in the background, there's someone who can step in with the structure, but that's when it's not as fun, right? Like it's when it flows that it has this work here. And there's a few other things too, because it almost is like the class is happy that there's a teacher who's sovereign too, right? Because we're like, oh, I know I can be in this class, and if the kids over there act up, the teacher's gonna like take care of it. And so there's sovereign in the sense of I'm being oppressed, but sovereign actually becomes a gift when it applies to other people, or it creates the frame that makes me go, oh, my time here will probably not be wasted because that guy who's sovereign is going to make sure that the classroom sticks together. So it's interesting where when we think about sovereignty as applied to me, it's oppressive. But when I think about sovereignty as assuring the environment, it's a gift. And there's something here, well, that speaks to Luber's like law affording culture. There's something about sovereignty affording space that then creates this kind of possibility of flow that's so critical. And a good sovereign sees their role as affording a space. But then, of course, the sovereign can only do that thing that they very well may want to do if the students get it. So the sovereign is like at the mercy of the coolness. It's very interesting. It's almost like a sovereign coolness dialectic here, right? Like maybe you have a benevolent sovereign and they literally just want to create a space, but they can't do it because the kids aren't cool. They just keep forcing the sovereign. Like, sovereign, come here and help me. Sovereign. And the sovereign's like, I don't want to. Well, you're a terrible teacher then. And so the sovereign's like, but if I keep breaking through the coolness, there won't be any flow, right? So it's this interesting kind of dynamic where the sovereign is looking to create that space, but then they also have to know how to respond to the student that needs their help in a manner that quickly restores the flow. So it's kind of this interesting dance they have to do. Mr. Jockin.
Daniel, I'm sorry to jump in, but you just captured my greatest dilemma of teaching is what you just said, because there have been absolutely times where students just don't get it. They don't get it. And they have a horrendous time. They're a massive buzzkill. And I remember getting an evaluation from a student, I guess anonymously. It's so fascinating. It's actually the same. This happened last semester. Same class, same class. One student, best class ever. Oh my God, this was amazing. Worst class ever. Didn't learn anything. He didn't help me in any way. It was awesome. So that's why I had to jump in. Because I'm like, yes, Dan, you just hit the nail on the head of like my greatest challenge of teaching is that problem.
Oh, I think it's a huge problem because I know, like, so for example, like I know there are times where I talk where mid-sentence I go to another idea because I finish the idea in my head but don't speak it. And I would know darn well that a student like would send me and be like, he jumps around too much. Another student, though, who's quote unquote cool would follow it and see how it's like a parenthetical hyperlink in the wiki article, and then we'll come back 20 minutes later. But you see, if they don't get it, it's so interesting because there's a way in which the sovereign, there's almost like the students have a certain sovereignty over the review sovereignty almost. Like they have a kind of power over the sovereign, as the sovereign has power over them. But it's funny because the power the students have is to not be cool, I guess, if I'm going to put it like, they could choose not to be cool or not to do the work to be cool, and there's nothing the sovereign can do. This is very interesting, and then I'll pass it to Luber because it makes me think. We had that reading group on the Republic with Justin, and Justin, Mr. Murphy pointed out something that was very insightful, where at the very beginning of the Republic, when Glaucon and Socrates are minding their own business going to town, and the guy whose name starts with a P comes along and says, "Hey, come with me." And they're like, "Well, we don't want to." And he's like, "Well, I'm stronger than you, so you're going to have to. We're going to go have a great philosophical conversation. You got to come with me." And Glaucon and Socrates is like, "Well, we got two choices. Either we get carried away, or we do what they, we like fight them, or we do what they say." And then Socrates goes, "Well, what if there's a third option, actually? What if we were to persuade you to let us keep going to the next village that starts with a P, that's name I forget?" And the guy looks at him and he says, "Well, what if I choose not to be persuadable?" Like, literally, what's so crazy about that response to me is right there, it shows you how weak philosophy is. Like, that's it. Like, right out the gate, it's like, if you have a society of people that just refuse to be persuadable, it's over, right? It's just kind of done. Now, they make an offer to Socrates and Glaucon. It's like, "Well, actually, guys, there's going to be these cool horse races with torches. It's going to be really neat." And so they kind of pass over this. But what's so interesting is I've been thinking about that start of the Republic. And basically, like, sometimes we look at the Republic and say, well, it's very totalitarian. It's, Karl Popper's like, it's oppressive. I think it's a simplistic reading, but it's also understandable. But wait a minute. The whole Republic almost is like, well, once people become unpersuadable, like, we're screwed. So we got to make sure that people never become unpersuadable with the design of the Republic. Because if they get to that place, there's nothing you can do to convince them. They can just choose not to listen to you. And so what's so interesting, too, like, if you literally have students that just won't do the work to be cool, per se, then the teacher can never create the classroom that has this flow effect. Like, there's nothing the teacher can do to create that culture that's kind of perfect. And so it's almost like, I guess, the parallel, and then I'll give it to Luber. If you have a society that refuses to be ethical, then the law, which is sovereign, has no choice but to step in and try to be the ethics. But then culture equals law, and it's a totalitarian system, and it's no fun anymore. But maybe the whole reason the law does that is because the people weren't, acknowledging that there was a coat draped over that chair, so they didn't sit down. Like, they kept breaking in line. So it's like, well, I guess we have to pass laws now that say you can't break in line. That's not cool. But the whole reason we had to do it is because the freaking populace didn't get it. Because social norms are like coolness, right? They're like these things you just get. You just need to get that you don't freaking take someone's chair with a coat draped over it. You just need to get that you don't you don't interrupt people constantly or stand outside their house and scream. Like, you just need to get that. Well, if they don't get that, like the students who just don't get it, then the culture breaks down. And so then the sovereign has to step in and replace it, and then everything goes to crap. And again, I was just really I'll give it to Luber now. I was just really taken, like, with that point at the beginning of the Republic. Like, all the time we talk about, it's easy to think that philosophy is so powerful. And in one way it is, if we talk about the intellectual class, Thomas Sowell, Paul Johnson, all this. But in another way, it's really, really weak. Because if people are like, well, I just don't care. Well, there's not much you can do there. Like, even Socrates is like, Glaucon looks over at Socrates and he's like, well, I guess we got to go with him then. We don't have. And it just makes me think of that. Anyway, Mr. Luber, please.
This is fantastic. Jockin, I have a question for you before I go on my thoughts. But so, like, kind of piggybacking off of the notion of the student having sovereignty, what if a student has a better sense of your sense than you? Like, is that
that's
possible?
a dream that happens. No. It is possible. It has happened. It's delightful. No, that's delightful. Because the thing is, like, actually, it's funny. I didn't know prior about the sovereign, right? That I forgot the name of the musician who wrote it, but basically, the rules don't make art. Art makes the rules. What that means is that an art piece can sometimes actually supersede the principles that a rule is supposed to point to. And I actually know this from experience. If I just give you a bunch of rules to follow, at best, you're just going to make a formulaic reproduction. But if you understand the principle, that may sometimes actually break rules, but actually kind of overcomes the breakage of the rule by revealing a principle that's actually super ordinately more important. A good teacher is always awaiting for that moment, always. Now, bad teachers don't. They're just formulating dickheads who just have like the image of like the rule set. Those suck. And it's not like you don't have rules. You're like you don't. It's not like you don't have them. You do. It's just that I get what you're. I think Uber, what you're getting at is, oh no, if a student achieves them, like my rubrics are all based on these kind of terms and senses that you can achieve. Legibility can be achieved in many different ways. The problem is when professors or teachers have a preset idea of what that solution already is. That's boring as fuck because then you're just waiting for students to hit that measure to kind of to reproduce mimetically that implicit goal. That's a waste of everybody's time, in my opinion. A better scenario is when you have a rubric based on some principle on a term sense like legible, and they come back with something that you didn't even anticipate. Oh, I love that. That's delightful. When I didn't even expect that solution, the student came back with, and it actually achieves the principle even better than I thought was actually possible. Delightful. But I do admit that's very rare. Most of my colleagues don't have that opinion and don't work that way. I'm a rare breed in that sense, but that's why I'm seeing you're getting at with that.
Thank you. And also, I just like your statement about the law comes from you. So in this respect, it seems ambiguous where the law comes from, because it's almost like it doesn't come from you in a way. It's like you kind of like discovered your own law, and kind of, that's what it seems like. Like if a student can
I'll challenge you on no because
okay.
it's within a discipline. So the discipline gives me the law. I am the teacher who trained in that discipline, and now I'm literally like, it's like Plato's fucking representation of the law at Credo, in Credo, where I'm a personification of that law in the sense of the discipline of graphic design. For example, like I can't even go to sculpture. If you throw me in a sculpture class, I am not the embodiment of that principle because of that discipline. So I'm useless. Like I cannot instruct students in sculpture, even if that's still an art field. It's actually not my discipline. I actually know there's actually enough of a difference that I can't actually represent it. So it's not even my own self-imposed law. And I bring this up because other instructors, we all agree, all come to a same consensus about what those laws are, because within a discipline, the discipline's what gives us those laws that we're subjects to. So that's actually wise, and that's why I'm challenging that point. It's not necessarily I'm making the law; it's the discipline that's making the law that I'm serving myself to. I'm subject to.
I see that. Okay, that's a good response. Okay. Because like I feel like I've been on the side where I've been the bad student and I've been the good student, and I can like think back on both times, and the real difference for the student's perspective is passion. Like I simply wasn't feeling personally the passion, just maybe even who I was as a person. I couldn't like tap into that type of care at the time. But then later in college, I definitely felt that passion, especially with a certain teacher. So with that said, my passion kind of coincided with him teaching a class about a book that he's writing that hasn't been published yet, that will be published, the next year essentially. And because, and I guess I just want your opinion just based off your response. And anybody can answer this too. Just that when you're teaching a discipline that, I mean, I guess it is a philosophy, but it was like philosophy meets linguistics. So it wasn't like pure philosophy. So the discipline is a little ambiguous. Whatever he's teaching is what I'm thinking. And if the discipline is a little ambiguous, I guess you're maybe probably talking about just teaching, the discipline of teaching, perhaps. But I'm just thinking in the cases where it's like you're learning something new together, where it's like the teacher kind of has an insight on something but hasn't captured it all the way, so he doesn't even know how to teach it all the way in a certain sense. In those situations, the law it was very alive, the law, in that sense, and it just felt like it was a small class with like 8 students. It was for like a long period of time. I don't know. It's like I don't really have a question, but I just feel like there's something different about that situation that maybe you could speak to.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely happened. So that requires, as you said, a smaller population. You're not doing 30 students. You're not doing 20. You're doing 10 at max, maybe 5 at that point. You're basically more in a fellowship at that point. That's definitely true. And a big aspect is absolutely that attention, passion, motivation. Daniel, intrinsic motivation. Anybody? It's absolutely the analogy I like to talk a lot about with that. Sorry, someone's giving me a phone call. Sorry, I had a phone call. Just cut me out for a second.
No worries, no worries.
All right. I like to use the analogy from boxing trainers. Joe Casamano talked about this when he was training Tyson. I basically light the fire. I don't cause the fire. I just add more logs to it. So it has to be already there. You already have to have some burning passion in the subject, in the student, to make that fire blaze up, especially under that context what you're bringing up, Luber, of basically where you're entering the liminal space of a discipline. So your example is more about a combination of two disciplines coming together, but the basic idea is the same regardless, where the most advanced, like my most advanced senior classes I did or grad school classes were based on basically pushing the limits or going to the edge of a discipline where you do not know. There's no preset definitions. Not even the professor knows. So the instructor even knows where you're going. That takes a high degree of internal intrinsic motivation, trust on both sides, and especially your dynamic is very different there. That's an idea where basically your students, or more colleagues, you're resonating off each other. That's basically what's happening. Because what's happening is they're doing certain actions, you're doing certain actions, and you're looking to see what the responses are, and you're doing kind of bricolaging resonance off that, and then you basically respond to that. It's very responsiveness. I find that generally the best classes have a quality of responsiveness, just like beauty. That's a very much a definite essence of beauty is not just intelligibility, but responsiveness, in the sense that it is not treating things in and of itself in a blocked square where it's just we're worrying about this little context. We're willing to respond to the resonances around it, interactions within it and between it and without it, that cause basically the potential for something new to come out of that is not already pre-known. That's kind of the key part. Because I will agree there is a difference between the introduction classes versus the more senior classes where we're in our known spaces where we're already known versus we're in the liminal spaces of pushing the boundary of a discipline and what it's trying to do. And a lot of times it is cross-disciplinary. So for example, in the graphic design discipline, at first we'll do a lot more formal abstraction projects, legibility, composition, figure ground space. This is all the good stuff. But we eventually start moving into cultural, normative, psychological states, mental states, and a lot of timing. Basically, is this the right intervention at this time, in this place, at this moment? We're dealing with much more advanced complications that are much more tangential, conditional, and require responsiveness in the moment that is not so universal or so abstractable in that sense. It's very much an equitable response versus a more universal response. So I'm getting a little abstract. I have to bring it down to concrete for you to make this really clear. But I would say there is some differences. But definitely, you're basically I agree with you. But I think also a big part too is that kind of I think it still holds what I'm saying in the sense of the Aristotelian model of Eudemian ethics of people who love the beloved, in this case, the discipline, so much they're willing to go into the liminal spaces of not even knowing where we're going. And even then, like in those classes, you're never, dude, a rubric in those classes is absurd. It's absolutely absurd. You wouldn't even bother to do it. You wouldn't even bother. You wouldn't. That's actually that'd be an indicator too. It's like where you have to. Stephen Covey talks about in Seven Habits where the level of measurement versus discernment changes. You go from it's basically an axis of measurement and quantification using, and rubrics are kind of intermediate state of that. They're a little bit better than a straight up measurement. Like you do give me this quantum of stuff versus the quality of the stuff. But then the highest level is discernment, where we're basically trusting that we're so attuned to the measures and the principles of what we're looking for together that we can trust that we can use discernment to measure what's working, we can discern what's working and what's not, what's resonating and not. That we don't even need to use concrete external documents or assets like that. So that's very rare. That's incredibly rare. That happens once every like 3 years to 5, to be honest, with like one group of students, especially as it's a larger entity. But Luber, I just want to build. I appreciate you asking this question. It's a lot.
Great. That was great. No, that definitely resonates with me. I feel like there was like magic. It felt like in my class, and like even in my teacher's book that he published, like in the preface, he like shouts out specifically my class because there was like he had a working theory and we really challenged the fuck out of it, and he made changes to his working theory based off of our exchanges in class. So it was great. I guess I'll just quickly say like my own notions that if I can just try to remember what they were. Okay. So it sounds like there's like a difference between metaphysics and ontology. And it sounds like in my mind, I'm associating law with metaphysics and culture as ontology, in the sense that ontology never, like, the whole point of law to me, and I forget exactly what particulars were said, because Jochen, that was really good stuff. But yeah, basically metaphysics, there's a transcendent feature to metaphysics in my mind, where ontology doesn't have that transcendent feature. It's everything that's contained within being. And metaphysics is like the containment of being, insofar as how it goes beyond that containment of being is and push back if you think I'm wrong. I just think I think if maybe there's something to that, where law, there's this like transcendent feature where it's like kind of always catching up with culture in a certain sense, because culture is always containing what is currently present, and then the law has to adjust what is currently present in a certain sense, so it has to kind of go beyond what is currently present. There's like foresight in law. Yeah, and there was something I wanted to say about coolness, but I forget. It'll come back to me. But yeah, if anyone has any thoughts on that, there's an analogy there.
So there's a bunch of things that come to mind. I'll pass it to Chetan. Dimitri, good to see you. So there's a few things. So it's interesting as well, because I think what we're more and more you see is that the space of the investigation are these liminal spaces, like where the line between the teacher and the student kind of vanishes, and then something is unveiled in that vanishing that kind of points to this problem of law that we are describing. Likewise, it's right at that space where economics can no longer reach its, that it has to acknowledge a non-economic space, that the character of economics starts coming out. And what's very interesting is because in one way we talked about how coolness creates flow, but that of course could be oppressive, right? There's the incred, oh, you're not cool, you're out. And if the sovereign uses that, it can be very oppressive, right? But then there's another way, when in the fellowship model, when the teacher and the students are together, where the thing that you're cool relative to is not reducible to the sovereign. And so then the coolness is not having this kind of oppressive structure. But this is where then it would seem like the remembering in Plato or the Meno is so big, because it's like, hey, we all, like when the kids are doing the skill with the graphic design, and they're like, yes, they're not saying, oh, I'm like Jochen now. Like Jochen, the student, everyone is excited because they see the skill manifesting according to the principles of the skill, not just the rules of the sovereign, of which the sovereign is there to help people realize. And that's why the coolness in the flow is not oppressive, because there's something beyond, dare I say, that kind of metaphysical, like it's beyond the classroom, that the classroom exists to point to, that really comes out in that magic place where even the teacher is like in fellowship with the students, because it's the liminal. Like the teacher themselves doesn't, like Jochen was saying, you don't have a rubric. Well, this is fascinating, because that would mean that education is at its best when it's pointing to something that's not in the classroom. Well, where is it? Like, where is it? Like Plato's like, well, it's in memory. Well, what the frick is memory? Like, and what we just keep seeing is in all of these spheres, and I can also speak to Jock, like one of my kids has really taken up Rubik's Cubes. I've never solved a Rubik's Cube in my life. And when they do it, you're like thrilled. You're like, oh my God. You could react and be like, Rubik's Cubes are stupid. And you pump them away because you're like, I've never done one. And you're speaking out of pathology. But there's a kind of delightfulness that you're like, oh my gosh, they're able to do this. I am very interested as well between the difference between law and principle. There's something there where the principle is in this beyond space, where you see the principle enacted. And that's what you get excited about. But all of these then are pointing that the goal of the classroom, of law, of economics, is to achieve a state that points to something beyond it. And then everyone has a sense of it when it occurs. Like if you were to, but then if you try to put it into words, people are like, well, I mean, you just got to get it, right? And it's almost like for me, this is the sublation of the loss of givens, because givens were a stand-in for the lack of a collective resonance with this principle that people get if they sense, but you have to get it to sense it. Like now that givens have basically been lost, the need to create the conditions of people sensing this something more that everyone appreciates becomes all the more pressing. So putting our finger on what this liminal space is that creates that feeling, and then being intentional about creating those liminal spaces that are not oppressive because they're spaces that are incubating people having this experience that points beyond the space, that the space exists to point beyond. This becomes central in our thinking and extremely necessary. And for me, the way I word it is it's the negation, sublation of givens is gifts. There's some feeling that the classroom is being gifted by something beyond it that creates this flow feeling. There's something about law that it's being gifted by something beyond the law that makes possible the society. There's some feeling of a gift, because beauty feels like a gift. Like goodness feels like a gift when you really experience it. Now, of course, we have to go through but when you have that conditional experience, then it has this kind of gift quality to it. I will now pass it to Chetan and Dimitri.
I think it's very interesting conversations in that sense. Maybe I think Dawkins' point about this question of internal law and external law, I think is extremely interesting, especially in the case of classrooms where, I think one of the first things is that we need to ask the question that, and it's a problem that we still raise in violence and non-violence question, that non-violence is not simply absence of violence. We remember that discussion. Similarly, if you look at non-sovereign ways of functioning, non-sovereign is not absence of sovereign. It's not anti-sovereign. Anti-sovereign would be very different. A-sovereign, anti-sovereign. No, the word you use is non-sovereign most of the times. That's, I think, an interesting word. I think Hannah Arendt uses this word. What are the non-sovereign ways of functioning? And that's one way to think about a classroom in that sense. That it's not an anti-sovereign position in some senses. It's a position which doesn't completely submit to the sovereign ways of functioning also. But there is something else. That it's an engagement with sovereignty. You don't want to emerge as a complete sovereign. That there's a problem in that positioning you're taking as and there's a problem if you completely let go of the problem of the sovereign in the classroom space. I think that's the other is this question of internal law is a question of command, and question of will, which is why if you look at even say religions in that sense, they have commandments placed into them. They don't have laws in simple sense. Your commandment has something to do with will. Will can make its own law, give law to something. Which is why commandments are not simple laws. If you read them as laws, they seem stupid. They have no meaning. They only have meaning when you read them through the will, which can will the law. Which is why command, in that sense, command of the will or commandment in that sense, always has this structure that they can follow the law even while breaking the law. That structure is always there and that is where, people who can self-regulate themselves, as Thomas was telling us, that self-regulation comes from the fact that your will can be trusted to break the law. And you can still be following it. that is where exception takes a different texture and a tone. Law functions at a level, law as in the legal jurisprudence function at a level where your will cannot be trusted to that level, where you have to obey the law irrespective of whether your will wills it or not. That's the structure, which is why law has something to do with obey, obedience in that sense. Where even if your will doesn't will something, you have to still obey it. And what is the structure of that problem in that sense? And at what point a willing something becoming a law to the extent that it doesn't matter that the law existed before it or not? What is the problem of and what is a form of society which can incorporate that as a legal principle? And that's the larger discussion between natural law and positive law, if you want to think about it within the language that we have today. Because natural law in some senses cannot be completely presupposed within the positivistic framework of law. And if you Agamben said it in one of his talks very nicely that today no Supreme Court, no judge in any court can actually use natural law as a principle to give his judgment. That space has narrowed down in society completely. Today, all judgments have to be based on positive law, which is law already written down in some book. And classrooms are different to the extent that classrooms can function through a mode where, as teachers and students both, we can incorporate different willing their own law. That space for incorporation exists, at least it should exist in a decent classroom, where a student, if it's bringing something new, it's giving birth to something. As teachers, we can support that process. That's what creativity is. That is why classrooms cannot be completely governed by laws. Because if students have to be only function through obedience, then what they are willing doesn't matter. And many classrooms work like that, of course. Many schools function like that, where what students are willing doesn't matter. What matters is whether they're following the law or not. And some structural issue emerges. I think that these are some of the contours which I was thinking about when I was hearing Thomas and Andrew talk. Yeah.
Well, that was magnificent. There's something that's going through my head. So there's this idea that sovereignty seems to be, there's some sort of presence of law sovereignty everywhere, like even when it's not there. Is it where thought is always seeking intelligibility and where sovereignty comes in order? Like, we need the universe to be ordered to be intelligible. And so we're always seeking intelligibility. And because we're always seeking intelligibility, we're always seeking understanding. And that means we're always looking for something that can give us understanding. If someone comes along and says, that's right, that's wrong, that's what you're supposed to do, and that's not. And it's almost like the movement of thought is always seeking intelligibility. And wherever thought goes, that movement toward intelligibility, that movement principle is what's sovereign. And then it's just manifest in, say, the teacher or government or whatever. And that might also be why law has this ability of being retrospective, because when you think back, you're looking for intelligibility in your memory. And you're like, oh, I was breaking the law when I did that. That's what the police officer was saying. Oh, now it makes sense to me. Now I understand the meaning of my actions. And it's almost like then when you're in the classroom and you're engaged in high-level conditioning to do a great art, you're looking for the intelligibility of that art at the highest level. And when you get that feeling of flow, that's where the intelligibility is like, yes, that's where we're trying to go. Now, this was a very, very final calls, teleological, Platonic structure of the movement of thought searching for intelligibility. But it's almost like wherever there's thought, there is a making thing, like thought almost by definition makes things intelligible, even if it's wrong, it's going to do it. And so it's like, it's creating the possibility of sovereignty wherever thought looks, because it makes the possibility of intelligibility, and that very intelligibility and the representations and representatives of that intelligibility then gain sovereignty because of that movement of thought, and that gives them authority. But of course, they can abuse that authority, or if the movement of thought is unintelligible, it's wrong, it's intelligible, but it's wrong, then the sovereignty becomes oppressive. And it's almost like because thought is trying to move into intelligibility or to achieve the aim of the art, and then it has a sense of achieving that in flow, that's why there's always this potential presence of force. Because if this is intelligible, then whatever makes this less intelligible is bad. You get rid of it. It's leading to chaos. Like when I look at a movie theater and I say, oh, chairs with coats draped over them are reserved. Chairs without coats are not reserved. The theater is now intelligible. If somebody comes along and sits in one of the chairs with a coat in it, I'm like, bad, bad, bad. They broke the sovereignty because that ruins the intelligibility of my understanding of the movie theater. So that person's wrong. I almost have a right to go up and tell them that was wrong. You shouldn't be sitting there. Like, it's not written anywhere, but because it throws off the intelligibility of the social order, there's kind of a grounds for that, telling the person they're in the wrong. So I wonder, and let me give it to Dimitri now and then Mr. Luber, that the movement of thought itself in having to create intelligibility and a sense of structure then is why you always have this presence of sovereignty, even where the sovereign isn't located, even when there is no law. It's just because thought is there, law is there. Per se. If thought is there, if intelligibility is there, then at least law as might is there. It might be there, and that's all we need. If the law as might, as we said earlier in the conversation, is there, well, there you go. And wherever thought is, there can be law as might, because there's order as might, and then everything just kind of flows from that. So anyway, a lot there, but let me give it to Mr. Dimitri and then Mr. Luber. So Dimitri, Platonic form of autumn, how are you, sir?
Yes, I'm going to pretend that this is last week. So I'm going to start by a quote. You guys might recognize it. If savings are investments, then savings which aren't investments don't exist. This point should be stressed. Savings for Keynes, which weren't savings, were, for all practical purposes, nothing at all. Spending was real, but savings were nothing but potential. And he goes on, and then he says, the only real savings were investment, and so it became critical for Keynes that savers weren't supported in their emotional disposition and habits by high interest rates. This might sound strange, for we spend our lives being told that spenders are the ones who need to learn morals and restraint. But Keynes here is introducing us to the possibility of vice savers. Those who save out of fear, trepidation, and a lack of discernment to know what to invest in. We will expand more on this later, blah, blah, blah. So this is a quote by Daniel in his article on Demand Part 1. And of course, immediately when reading this, it made me think about anal personality, like the way Freud wrote about the vice saving your excrement and getting a certain sense of power out of that. Now it's interesting that sovereignty is mentioned here, because power, might, sovereignty, master morality kind of rests on pure expenditure, not on thrift or saving and these kinds of things. So well, what opened up this kind of expenditure, or also on the other side, the generous consumption of sovereignty, is for Gerard called ritual sacrifice. Now, the modern economy is based, we could say, on consumption. People like to talk about it, right? We live in a society of consumption. The way that Zizek talks about it is that this is only the case insofar as consumption is, this society of consumption is conceptualized as appearing in its opposite, and that is thrift itself. So the true consumer would be the junkie, whereas in capitalism, according to Zizek, everyone is kind of reduced as a consumer to being a thrift saver. And this is where you get, you know, the idea of invest or buy, and then you get a surplus for free. For example, like a toothpaste commodity, where it's like, it says you get 30% for free. Well, then of course you are like, yeah, but I just want that 30%, don't mind the rest. But it has to be this way. So I think this, when you stumble upon thrift in this article, it's really the crux of it, because it seems like if we take Zizek and Girard's arguments that the modern economy relies in a way on this vice saving, on this type of thrift, which is on the other hand also a way that we go beyond the ritual sacrifice that opens up the generous or like the pure expenditure or the generous consumption of the sovereign. So in a sense, the vice of the saver is a solution to the prior problem of pure expenditure and of this sovereign this sovereign consumption that was opened up by ritual sacrifice, right? So it shouldn't be a surprise that in like the way Lacan describes fascism is that fascists basically wanted to do ritual sacrifice to obscure gods. It's very Girardian the way Lacan thinks about fascists. So they wanted to return to this type of sovereignty. And of course, who did they scapegoat? The Jew, which isn't that the exact isn't that the great example, like the way they conceptualized it as an embodiment of this like capitalistic paradox of thrift saver, like someone who is a consumer, but it's also based on thrift and this kind of anal personality. So yeah, I think this is like what Keynes stumbles upon, this anal vice saver that is a problem, but it's also a solution to another problem, which is ritual sacrifice of let's say pre-modern sovereignty. And of course, we don't want to reduce or we don't want to return to this type of generosity or consumption, or let's say even investment that goes beyond the vice of saving in the sense of ritual sacrifice. So this is what, this was really, to me, the most interesting part of the article, and opened up a lot of questions.
Well, first off, it's wonderful to be read. I really appreciate it. And second, I actually think this is perfect because in the same way that there's a different, so for Keynes, what he understood that if you save money, it's like people are like, oh, they're saved, they're going to buy up all the cheap prices when the economy goes down. Keynes is like, no, they might just save and be afraid. And so then they're storing up money, not actually creating demand, so it becomes a vice. It could be a virtue if they would actually use that spending and invest, but they don't tend to, because the very morals that make you save tend to make you less likely to take on risk when you need to take on risk. Not always, but that's where he's talking about the vice spending. In the same way, actually, you have a form of teaching where people store up knowledge, they keep it in their head, but they never employ it into a skill to create a classroom that has the flow so the movement of thought can move toward beauty. So there's a form of education. So what you have in Keynes is you have spending and saving that are actually just dialectically not really advancing. The speculative reason per se would actually be the investment, because you speculative reason what you should take a risk at, and then you invest and you go from there. But you can't, what he's critiquing is in classical economics, assume, yes, savings deals with the problem of spending that's wasteful, but neither of those necessarily address the problem of the demand event horizon. That's where you then need to move into risk-taking, investment, in a different coordination of resources. Well, guess what? That's the same with the classroom. You have a bunch of stupid people that don't care about learning, and well, let's take care of that by having someone with a bunch of facts in their head that kind of deals with it, but actually you're not creating the condition of the flowing classroom, right? So what you're seeing is in economics, teaching, and I think law as well, because law has to create the conditions of culture for intrinsic motivation. Ultimately, what we're seeing now is a movement to the need to really emphasize the You need to take the knowledge in your head and not just store it up, but actually exercise it in a skill to create a classroom like Jochen was talking about, that we're talking about, that is the movement of intelligibility toward the higher principles. The same as my argument is what needs to happen in economics. If you look closely at demand, you will see that the systemization of economics must now move into the principles of economics, which are ultimately the stuff that we've been talking about, creating demand versus stimulating it, which if we do not, we cannot move beyond the great stagnation. Likewise, the classroom really needs to own the movement in the direction of the principles of what are being taught, not just the information. And that's where you're going to be investing your knowledge as a teacher into skills to create these kind of environments. This is the sublation of all of these that needs to occur. So that movement in economics that ultimately, for me, I'm going to argue that Keynes leads to, also has a parallel on education when we get into people like Neil Postman. But let me give it to Mr. Luber as we come up on the end. And then if anyone has any final things before I run and get the wedding venue together, I've enjoyed it. Thank you for reading that section. Because again, there's like, it's a similar, like, there's a form of vice saving. Well, guess what? There's a form of vice knowledge too. Like, you've stored up a bunch of facts, but you never employ it into the conditioning of an environment to move people toward principles. So that's another form of just storing facts, like storing money. And the problem is the very ethics, like in the way that Keynes says that the ethics that makes you like save money tends to be the ones that make you afraid when it's time to take on risk. We now basically have an education system that the very ethics that would make you a PhD are the ones that make you avoid the employment of that knowledge into skills. So you have like vice knowledge that then also can be employed. Not everywhere, it depends. Anyway, I'll stop. Mr. Luber, please.
I'm just thinking how much sense this makes. And there's actually something quite horrifying about this. It's like there's this pattern that you're pointing out that is that's applicable to everything. So it's like making me feel like a little bit of a robot right now, in the sense that it's like maybe I'm just not programmed well, and that there's like a certain programming that needs to occur to the human race, like an update. And like the fact that I can even like, I don't know, the analogy itself just scares me. I mean, I don't personally actually think of humans as robots, but it's just like there's something very programmable about this and how much sense it makes in terms of it tracking, I guess, human behavior ultimately. So yeah, I just kind of wanted to point that out, and it's just making me think what I was going to say earlier. It kind of coincides with that, but I was just thinking basically that clearing is the limit realizing a difference, is what it seems like to me. And what I mean by that is like to take like the topic of coolness, when knowing or accepting only doing the right thing in a situation, it's like, oh, you're cool because you are doing the right things in this situation. You are picking up on these right features of the situation, so to speak. And that there's something cool about that, yes. And then at the same time, you take it to its limit, and it seems like, wait a second, it sounds like there's something very uncool about the fact that you're only willing to do the right things, whatever that means in that situation, or pick up on the right things in that situation. There's something a different type of cool emerges out of realizing the difference in the limit. And that's what I mean by the clearing. And that's, to me, I would say maybe a different definition that I have not personally thought of like Heidegger's notion of clearing. And then basically what you're saying, Daniel, I feel like it makes so much sense. It makes so much sense. Like, I want it to happen, but it's like, it almost is like you have your finger on the clearing so much so that it's like, when does that sublate itself, so to speak?
Occur when we successfully grow watermelons and they're not eaten by the groundhogs. That's when it's going to be the skeleton key to the metaphysical structure of reality. For me, the pattern that you were talking about emerges in all of these fields because the frenemy brain prioritized low-order causality over high-order causality, ergo quantification over qualification, which leads to the manifestation of this structure of making x equal y instead of x arrow to y and back and forth, which would lead to the emergent principle of the human condition that has to maintain that arrow instead of the equal sign, based on the earlier conversation. And so what happens is the human, so you talked about the clearing, let's put it this way. In every single field, the human has to be the element in the field that creates the clearing, okay? The brain naturally views the clearing as nothing. It's not quantifiable. So the brain tells the human, you're not doing anything. And the human says, you're right, I'm not, unless they know better. But why would they know better? Because everything they see makes the clearing look like nothing. So then they leave the clearing and they go back to the forest. Well, that's that. And so the brain is in conflict with the human element of the clearing that only the human can do. And it's then just a matter of probability that the majority of people in every single field will not do that because it's a conflict. And so then that's what manifests. So basically, what you will have to do is, in order to lead to a negation sublation of these fields out of this pattern, is basically teach somehow the average person that conflict between the human element and the brain is a good thing. That's a success. That's a sign that you're thinking. Even though you're beautiful, Dimitri, even though everything in you will feel like it's a wrong thing. If you can't do that, then the pattern recurs and recurs and recurs and recurs. But hopefully it may cease recurring eventually and soon enough. But I must go. Thank you so much. This has been a treat. You're all beautiful. Thank you.